Good afternoon. A very warm welcome to all of you to RSIS's seminar on ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific, COVID-19, and the future of Asean Centrality. I'm Dr. Joel Ng, a research fellow from the Center for Multilateralism Studies, and will be moderating today's discussion. One quick note, unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, we're very sad to be unable to introduce Dr. Termsak, who is not available today. Okay, we've had a quick change in the lineup as a result. So anyway, on to today's discussion. We've had two very excellent days of discussion on the changing environment in Southeast Asia and beyond. And for those unfortunately unable to join us in the previous 2 days, we've on Tuesday, our panelists considered the impact of COVID-19, which was having a great number of impacts on diplomacy in the region. While it had certainly disrupted every aspect of diplomacy, introducing new challenges and shifting many priorities, the panelists agreed that this had only reinforced the need for multilateral approaches to solve common problems. These approaches needed to be flexible, inclusive, and there was a discussion on a variety of ways to keep things moving. ASEAN has been relatively well prepared at a regional level and activated several mechanisms that were required as the outbreak spread. But the rising geopolitical tensions between external partners in our wider region was a different sort of challenge. So on Wednesday, we then turned to the question of multilateralism and defense diplomacy, as the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific develops alongside competing visions about the region, such as the Belt and Road Initiative and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. ASEAN could not presume that its centrality itself to maintain this role. This presents a double challenge to ASEAN's institutions to adapt to both the changing physical as well as political environment. Now, this then brings us to today, where we'll be doing our best to gaze a little bit at our crystal ball and see where these trends seem to be leading us. With COVID-19 having thrown everything we thought we knew about the world at the end of 2019, this is not an easy task, but so we've put this to our esteemed panel to help us discern these emerging trends. We'll be looking at the questions that revolve around this theme of ASEAN centrality in the wider Indo-Pacific. How are ASEAN initiatives likely to interact with external powers? Does ASEAN have sufficient legitimacy to be, or to continue to be, the organizing fulcrum in this wider region? Can its mechanisms lessen growing tensions between external powers? And how might ASEAN redefine its role given deglobalizing pressures and rising tensions? I'm now delighted to introduce our speakers for today. So an additional speaker that we've brought in place of Dr. Termsak and graciously coming in at the last minute is our very own Dr. Frederick Kliem, visiting fellow at the Center for Multilateralism Studies here at RSIS. Secondly, we have Professor Alan Chong, who is head of the Center for Multilateralism Studies. And finally, and last but certainly not least, Dr. Chiew-Ping, Senior Lecturer in Strategic Studies and International Relations at the University Kebangsaan, Malaysia, or National University of Malaysia. So a very brief reminder before we start, the videos for all these webinars, including today's, will be made available on YouTube shortly. Do look out for them on RSIS's NTU YouTube page and subscribe to be notified when the videos come out. The speakers will speak very briefly for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and answers. So please use the question and answer panel below your screen to make any questions so that I can put them forward to our panel. Without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Frederick Kliem. Frederick.
Hi, good afternoon. So I've been asked to step in at the very last minute. Thank you, Joel, for the last minute invitation. I really appreciate it, although I shall not even pretend that I can even remotely make up for what would the distinguished speaker, Termsak, would have said. Nonetheless, I've been given the task to give a bit of an overview of what is happening and, most importantly, give an estimation of my perspective on what is happening. And I had about an hour or so to consider what I think is relevant of the topic that I've studied for the past 10, 15 years, which is ASEAN, and how ASEAN is involved in the wider region. And I have decided to come up with a brief title, which I call The New Equilibrium for the Indo-Pacific. but the new equilibrium for the Indo-Pacific includes the subtitle with ASEAN at the heart. Okay, this will go slightly beyond the traditional notion of centrality, and I will come to this in a minute. I would like to share perhaps 4 or 5 observations with you today. So my first observation is probably that comes to no surprise to anyone here, that there is a US-China competition that has been with us for a long time, but is heating up recently on ever more fronts. Of course, we have the old South China Sea issue that is at least as relevant as it always was, perhaps even more in this year. But we also have other fronts. Recently, we had the tech sector front being opened as well. And it seems that Mike Pompeo has, even if Trump is not as engaged on this topic, at least Mike Pompeo seems to have found his new favorite enemy in China. And whether this is helpful for a diplomat, for the top diplomat or not, is a different question. Nonetheless, he says what he seems to think is right and what he wants. And I think this is contributing to an ever more competitive situation here in this region. The second observation I would like to share is that China is becoming ever more assertive vis-a-vis ASEAN members, especially, of course, in the South China Sea. This is something that will ring true, certainly with our Vietnamese friends, who I value very much and I'm keeping close contact with. So I think for them, this will probably be the most important observation, but this is also one of the triggers of the ever more increasing US-China competition here in this region. The third observation, equally brief, is that perhaps this is a bit more new, that we have assertiveness, Chinese assertiveness, increasingly against China, against India and Australia. So India has always had trouble with China along their northern borders, of course, as you all know. But recently, last year we had the Doklam standoff, and now this has heated up even more with the Ladakh standoff, where there have actually, on the line of actual control, where there have actually been casualties on the Indian side, possibly also on the Chinese side. We don't exactly know the numbers, but we definitely know that on the Indian side, at least 20 people died in a very rough fist fight, interestingly enough. So we then have increasing presence, Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean, anti-piracy missions and so forth. So India sees itself a bit sandwiched by China. On the other hand, we have Australia, which has for long been trying to reap the rewards of economic engagement with China and blending out any strategic issue that may come along with it. And yet at the same time, going along with China. However, latest Scott Morrison, but perhaps even slightly before, has changed the tone substantially. He's been very vocal on the WHO inquiry into the origin of the coronavirus, which was clearly directed against China, and he's been very active on that front. And this possibly comes at the back of alleged cyber attacks on Australia, alleged interference in domestic politics in Australia, and possibly also greater worries that China may become active closer to their northern borders in the, southwestern Pacific. So Australia is slightly worried there too. So this brings me to my fourth observation. And the fourth observation really goes beyond this binary, that we need to go beyond this binary US-China picture. At the very least, we have de facto a Quad versus China dynamic going on here. The Quad nations being Japan, Australia, India, and the United States, of course, as most of you will know. So the Quad development, just to sum it very briefly up for those who haven't been following very closely, on the back of remarkably similar free and open Indo-Pacific concepts coming out of all the Quad countries, specifically called free and open Indo-Pacific, except for India, which has adopted free and open Indo-Pacific, from my observation, in all but name. All of those are remarkably similar. We heard yesterday, was it yesterday, I think, on the seminar, that there are differences in the free and open Indo-Pacific concepts. Yes, I agree, but the differences pale in comparison to what unites the free and open Indo-Pacific concepts. The differences here particularly concentrate on a geographic definition of what is the free and open Indo-Pacific, what really is the Indo-Pacific. But the core elements of the free and open Indo-Pacific are remarkably similar in all 4 Quad capitals. This has led to a gradual upgrade from 2017, where Quad 2.0, the second version of the Quad, really emerged from senior officials level, so to foreign ministers level now. We had a first tabletop exercise of the Quad, and possibly we will very soon have the first direct naval military exercise by the name of Malabar, where we still think, if I haven't missed any news today, we still think India will invite Australia, making this a de facto Quad military exercise. So the question is, why have the Quad capitals upgraded the meaning of the Quad, the depth of the Quad, and the robustness of the Quad? So I would like to perhaps invoke Stephen Walt here, balance of threat theory, and just to make it very brief, detect ever-increasing threat perceptions regarding China in Quad capitals. Whereas the first Quad failed, the second Quad will not fail. This is my prediction, simply because the threat perception in the Quad capitals have substantially increased when it comes to China. So my final observation really starts, and here is where ASEAN comes in, and where I shall dwell a bit on, is the question, so where can we go from here short of conflict? If we have this confrontation, Quad vis-a-vis China, I've now explained why I don't call it US-China, but actually Quad-China. Where do we go from here? Do we go back to the Cold War, hoping that no major power conflict happens and just accept that there will be minor conflicts here and there, proxy wars here and there, where many people suffer? No, I don't think so. I think the basic raison d'etre, if you like, of international relations, of our subject, is to try to come up with ideas to prevent such conflict, okay? So where can we go here short of conflict? And this is where my fifth observation comes in, ASEAN. ASEAN is very relevant, even if they don't know it yet. I think we can all agree that this containment, and China would accuse the Quad capitals of the Quad and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific divisions being a containment strategy. I think we can all agree that containment is an outdated Cold War concept. For one, China is deeply entrenched in the structural elements of the Indo-Pacific. Many regional, indeed global challenges also require Chinese cooperation. There's no way we can deal with issues such as climate change, refugees, you name it, without Chinese cooperation one way or another. So classical containment, trying to shut China off and kind of build a wall around China and hope the problem goes away at some point, is short-sighted and is very unlikely to be a policy success. So at the same time, we cannot go on with business as usual, because as we know from history, quite often where there is tension, eventually explosion will follow. So what I propose is that instead of containing China, the Quad countries, and together with ASEAN, should try to manage China's rise. They should try to channel it and not frustrate it. The question is, what can a sustainable China management strategy be built on? What can it look like? And I suggest it should be built on 2 pillars, and here Asean Centrality is very important. One, we need to facilitate communication between the 2 blocks, if you like, and we need to maintain economic and information exchange wherever possible. But at the same time, we cannot go on with business as usual. Without offense to my Chinese friends, I believe that China is behaving in ways that at least merits having a second pillar, which is constraining China wherever it is necessary. Not containing, but constraining China. So for the latter part, we have the Quad. The Quad is an organization, or it's not an organization, but it's a dialogue with a very heavy military bias. And like it or not, this is here to stay, is my prediction, and I also think this is a good thing. We need this hard balancing element as well. Hard balancing via increased naval deployments, exercises, and greater strategic alignment among the Quad capitals. But this is only one aspect. This would inevitably lead to miscalculation, conflict, and so forth. It's necessary to push back against an overly ambitious, possibly overly ambitious Chinese foreign policy, but it is alone not sufficient. We need a diplomatic, economic, and even perhaps an information instrument too. A balancing strategy by the Quad, therefore, must be anchored in a, in a multilateral Indo-Pacific architecture that can somehow smoothen the hard balancing edges. In other words, we need to take the edge of the Quad versus China containment notion, okay? ASEAN comes in here. ASEAN has all the necessary mechanisms for that in place already. There is no more need for ASEAN to add anything to it other than statements of intent. What role can it adopt? So you heard it here first. Fence sitting for ASEAN is no longer an option, I believe. ASEAN wishes to not take sides. We all understand that this is a mantra that is always followed. We understand that it is reasonable, and we also understand why everybody says it. However, I think this is no longer an option. Even if it still is. In a couple of years, it won't be anymore. ASEAN will have to choose sides. However, this choosing sides does not mean I will forever be on the American side. I will entertain in a military alliance with America. Of course not. This is all outdated Cold War stuff. Forget about this. We need an issue-based alignment. ASEAN needs to be aware that sometimes you have to choose sides. And I think the latest statement of the ASEAN Summit, the chairman's statement of the latest ASEAN Summit, has actually shown that ASEAN is getting a bit fed up with China in the South China Sea. And they're getting their act together and producing a relatively strong statement. And also, as we all know, if not all ASEAN capitals would at least implicitly endorse such a notion, it wouldn't be passed. So I guess the strong statement we saw in the last chairman's statement against China is already an implicit acknowledgement that ASEAN knows a complete fence sitting is no longer an option. The question is here, how can this be institutionalized? What can really happen? So for one, ASEAN has an intrinsic interest in a stable, free and open Indo-Pacific, and stability in this region mostly depends on China and Quad dynamics. I think we can all agree on this. Second, ASEAN needs to regain proactive centrality. It's not just centrality, right? Centrality, it is very often said centrality must be earned. Okay, true, but how can it be earned if ASEAN is merely reacting? And you could say the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific was merely a reaction to the narrative changing from the Asia-Pacific towards the Indo-Pacific. So ASEAN was merely reactive, okay? But centrality must be more than this. It must be proactive. So Martin Natalegawa has suggested, former foreign minister of Indonesia, has suggested a very bright mind. He has suggested there should be an Indo-Pacific treaty based on the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. That's great. I completely support this, but it's not enough. Same with the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. It is great. ASEAN clearly shows that it is embracing the Indo-Pacific. ASEAN has, until the outlook on the Indo-Pacific shied away from calling it the Indo-Pacific, was seen a bit of a Quad concept, right? A Quad interpretation of the region. But now ASEAN has embraced it, right? But it's lacking substance still. It's relatively vague, and you can read it any way you want, right? You can read it conflictual as a hawk. You can also read it as a dove. However, ASEAN needs to realize that there's no fence sitting anymore. So I think if ASEAN becomes more proactive, ASEAN centrality can be brought to a higher plane. It must be more than being a convener, it must become a mediator. So if you want to call it perhaps a proactive moderator, or from convening power towards moderating power. I'm an eternal ASEAN optimist, but this is possible. I assure you this is possible. ASEAN features very strongly in all Indo-Pacific visions, from Japan to Australia to India to the United States. All of them put ASEAN at the heart of their strategy, of their strategies for this region. And ASEAN can hold those powers to account for their words here. Also, the latest statement again shows that ASEAN is getting fed up with Chinese unilateralism on certain front. On the other side of the fence, we have Beijing, who also very much value their relations with ASEAN too. This includes investment and strong relations, G2G, B2B, even P2P, right? People to people, you name it. But there's also an ideological component by Chinese foreign policy of being indigenously Asian, right? Staying away from keeping external powers out and so forth. The Asian civilizations idea of Chiew-Ping cannot mean China only, right? They must include Southeast Asia, and ASEAN can really hold into account there. So ASEAN has also gained a great reputation for reasonably successful hosting multilateralism for decades and has get a good reputation there. So ASEAN can legitimately claim to be relevant to everyone, to be an honest broker, not firmly on either side, but choosing sides wherever necessary. Okay. Again, Pak Marty's suggestion of this Indo-Pacific Treaty is brilliant, but we need more than this. So we have RCEP, right? We have this economic interdependence here in the region where ASEAN sits at the heart of with RCEP. This keeps the growth of China's success tied to the regional economies in this region. This is relevant for trade, of course, but it is also relevant for economic diplomacy and communication. And this clearly must alleviate containment concerns in China. Second, we have the ADMM+ framework, which ASEAN hosts, and where ASEAN can manage defense diplomacy among Quad members and China. And this format must really try to focus on the hard defense issues. As important as other things are, I think defense communication must be absolutely prioritized in order to take the edge of this Quad-China confrontation. And I think the ADMM+ framework is a relatively reasonable forum to start from. Most importantly, however, ASEAN must do its absolute utmost to make the East Asia Summit the undisputed strategic communication forum. Perhaps it already is, but you see that the Americans are, for instance, not as interested. And ASEAN must really try to be proactive here and lobby and show that the East Asia Summit is necessary if you want to prevent conflict and if you want to reap growth opportunities here in this region. ASEAN must leverage its reputation and turn the Quad-China rivalry into an opportunity for it, right? To regain centrality, proactive centrality, be an honest broker that manages and facilitates communication, the communication side of this China management strategy. Lastly, my very last point, sorry, Joel, if I went a bit long. If I start talking, I find it difficult to stop. I make my last point, which is that on the Quad side, the Quad should also try to gain a better reputation here in the region, and they can do so with the Quad Plus format. So I understand they have started the Quad Plus format, but they have stopped it after only a few months. Quad Plus should include countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, perhaps even Philippines if they would come on board. But it should be very clear that the Quad and the Quad Plus are two entirely different formats. So for instance, Quad Plus should focus generally on non-traditional security issues like COVID-19, right? As they did earlier this year. Aside from possibly further enhancing regional security architecture here with the Quad Plus format, this also helps to move Quad's reputation from a containment mechanism to a more inclusive initiative. So with this, I end, and I'm looking forward to all of your questions and to my fellow panelists' presentation that are about to follow. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Fred. That was an interesting exposition on the nature of the Indo-Pacific competition and ASEAN's role in it. Now we quickly move on to Professor Alan Chong, head of the Center for Multilateralism Studies. Professor Chong.
Okay, good afternoon, one and all. I believe that RSIS events will share my video. Okay, this is basically the title of my brief talk for 15 minutes. Asean Centrality under Transitional Polycentrism. Now, this big mouthful, Transitional Polycentrism, is a concept borrowed from my last edited volume on international security in Asia Pacific. All right, this condition describes a lot of what Frederick Kliem just said. Great powers are trying to supplant ASEAN in terms of leadership of the region with grand schemes like the Belt and Road, various permutations of the Quad, and of course the United States basically sidelining ASEAN under Trump and so on. But amidst all this so-called decentered relationships, you have ASEAN still plodding on with this idea of ASEAN centrality. And by and large, I think it is the default mode for pushing any kind of regional project, whether it's in economics or diplomacy or the South China Sea Code of Conduct and so on. And polycentrism also means that there is an increasing salience of non-traditional security issues, something which the previous 2 days panels have also alluded to. Now, non-traditional security actually pushes for ASEAN centrality in the sense that lots of bad things, from climate change happen to ASEAN, and that means that ASEAN, like it or not, will have to come together. Okay, so COVID-19, is ironically a positive moment for ASEAN, because it brings us together. Okay, we need to understand how to create travel bubbles. We need to produce something called an ASEAN Recovery Fund, and we need to share, the latest medical intelligence on vaccine development, containment measures, and other forms of hygiene measures to prevent further spread, and so on. Next slide, please. So my argument under this condition, goes in two directions, and this is the gist of what I'm going to say. A, there is an established and recurring pattern of great power dissension in relation to the ordering of the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific. Okay, in other words, I'm going to say that all the great powers that are significantly invested in the Indo-Pacific region do not have what it takes to drive regional leadership. All right, and point B, which is perhaps the more interesting for dedicated ASEAN watchers, shows that ASEAN by default, I think, will continue some notion of centralized leadership, because it is by default the going concern. All right, let me go to the next slide. Now, first of all, China. Okay, with all due respect, again, to any Chinese diplomat, joining this forum, China is literally a latecomer to regional institution building. Okay, I understand that people who study and write on China might have a different view, but it is a latecomer in relation to joining regional institutions and fostering them as actual, conflict mitigating institutions or development promoting institutions. Chinese policy towards much of the Indo-Pacific is also inconsistent and in flux. Again, I'm speaking from a Southeast Asian perspective. Okay, the view from Beijing may seem very different. Okay, from what I'm saying, and also in Southeast Asia, speaking broadly from the perspective of the ASEAN 10, Beijing seems to be exhibiting the tendency to vacillate between strategies or the artichoke. Okay, the artichoke, for those of you who are not familiar, is the type of vegetable, okay, a salad vegetable, that you eat by picking off leaf by leaf. All right, so it appears that from time to time, Beijing will try to surprise ASEAN by saying, oh, I have this independent initiative with the Mekong Delta countries or Mekong Basin countries, where we can foster cooperation in spite or alongside Asean Centrality and so on. And of course, there was that little bit of a diplomatic debutante-like behavior by Beijing, I think 3 or 4 years ago, where the Chinese foreign minister showed up in a few ASEAN capitals saying, oh, we have a group of ASEAN countries who have a more nuanced position on the South China Sea, i.e. more pro-Beijing and so on. And then, the effect of that kind of stunt would be to compel, all these ASEAN countries who hosted the Chinese foreign minister's sudden visit to deny that they agreed to side with Beijing on the South China Sea. All right, so these stunts are not doing Beijing any favors. Worse, okay, if you look at the current, foreign policy practice of pursuing hybrid military and diplomatic strategies targeting ASEAN and other great powers, it holds no favors for China. All right. In fact, the fear of Chinese so-called fifth column activities or influence operations puts everyone across the Indo-Pacific, all right, including India, and Sri Lanka, plus all of ASEAN 10 and other countries in the entire map of Indo-Pacific, on a certain wariness about what Beijing is up to, all right? And finally, much as China appears to be the wealthier economic power vis-a-vis the United States or Japan at the moment, it is still no substitute for consistent soft power on other fronts. So China, is both neighbor and friend, but it's a friend with a small f, all right, unfortunately. Okay, next slide, please. Now, when it comes to the United States, okay, Trump has lost a lot of goodwill amassed, all right, over the preceding two presidencies. Even George Bush Jr., all right, despite all the sharp edges arising from his execution of the global war on terror, actually amassed a lot of goodwill, all right, by the time he left office in relation to the countries along the entire Indo-Pacific. Even with China, all right, under George Bush Jr., they managed some kind of accommodation despite nasty accidents like the EP3, reconnaissance plane crisis and so on. But today, what do you have? Okay, you have a Trump presidency going to default position, like, this temptation of looking, domestically to cater to a domestic sense of revulsion against the United States economy, not reaping the full benefits of globalization. And of course, there is the pull of Atlanticist relationships, although much has been made of Trump's rocky relations with any number of national leaders in the European Union. His attention is still looking that way, all right? And that's the way he is. And he brings together a set of policy advisors that are totally aligned with his perspective. And it's still very Atlanticist in orientation, even if he doesn't agree with the French president all the time, definitely not completely with Angela Merkel or the Italian prime minister and so on and so forth. But still, he likes to compare the United States with, European countries and so on. And of course, when Trump looks across the Pacific from the United States, he sees the China threat, becoming a convenient target game. Okay, and what he has done is actually accelerate a very negative trend that has been latent in American body politic. The idea that China is indeed the rising peer competitor, and all your neo-realist theories about power transition come in, all right, and predict a very dire consequence about a possible US-China military clash and so on. And sadly, in Washington, there is something that appears to be a virtual foreign policy consensus on countering Beijing on diplomatic, security, and economic fronts. And of course, Fred alluded to the information technology front with Huawei, etc. So the United States is not at the moment ready for leadership of either the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific. It's there because of its heft. Okay, and it's a legacy issue. It's military power bar none. Okay, and it can project power at very short notice. So, by historical legacy, it is still a factor to be reckoned with. But in terms of leadership, I'm sorry, okay, it cannot be perceived to be a realistic leader of, the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific at the moment. Okay, next slide, please. Now, what about these other two? Now, Japan potentially can play a leadership role because Japanese diplomacy has improved in very sophisticated ways. It's pushed this idea of politically correct developmental community with ASEAN, and its vision of the FOIP is actually very benign, very pro-ASEAN. Okay, the problem with the Japanese foreign policy establishment is that it has this culture of underplaying its strengths. Okay, there is a weak sense of foreign policy assertiveness, and of course there's every appearance of playing follow the leader. Okay, leader being the US as a senior partner in the US-Japan special relationship. Even under Trump, okay, you look at the reception that Prime Minister Abe gave to Trump when Trump visited Japan last year. It was like nothing ever happened. All right. In terms of India, I think the China-centric threat focus will cloud the way it looks at either the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific or even the BRI. All right, and India, being what it is, has its own domestic distractions, and I think COVID-19 is emerging to be one huge domestic distraction that will, put India on the sidelines of leadership in the region. If I may switch back to my own screen, I want to show you this picture from the Japan Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Okay, it's not perfect, but you can see that when the Japanese Foreign Ministry draws this circle of their vision of the FOIP, across the Indian and Pacific Oceans, right in the middle, that slightly darkened orange patch
is labeled ASEAN connectivity. All right, there can be no clearer picture, I think, that vindicates the ASEAN document, ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific than this. Okay, this is produced by the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and was given to me at one of the talks I attended outside Singapore before COVID-19. All right, and this is clear evidence that, you know, Japan regards ASEAN as basically the pin that links both the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And of course, it's so convenient also for Tokyo to treat ASEAN as the pin, because it allows Japan to say, unlike the other great powers, look, ASEAN will help me produce a corridor to link South Asia and potentially East Africa as well into this grand vision of development. Okay, and it looks inclusive. That's why I keep saying that it's politically correct and so on. Now, back to the slides, my final slide. The picture of, okay, next slide, please. Yeah, okay, and this is my final slide. The picture of regionalism, if you look at it historically, and I'm mindful of the chair's reminder to everyone that this final day's proceedings cast a historical perspective on the whole picture of regionalism. And I think if you look in a nuanced way at the implications of the AOIP, the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, and what appears to be this new constellation of actors that appear to be pushing regionalism as a vehicle to contain China, it's a replay of the drama from perhaps 60 years ago or 70 years ago. Now, I have to take you a little bit through this spotty history, because when much of the independent states that we now broadly classify under Indo-Pacific became independent, your India, your Philippines, your Indonesia, your Burma, Myanmar, Malaya, then Malaysia, Singapore, and much of Indochina. The hot topic was who amongst these newly independent lot would lead. Okay, so India and Burma were actually in front, along with the Philippines. They were all saying, okay, we are all Asians, let's try this broad pan-Asian regionalism called Asian race relations. So this was taking place in the years after World War II. One must not forget that. And then there was China under Mao Zedong saying, look, we need to engage all of Asia in this new colonial, anti-colonial struggle, that still needs to reach a definitive end. So it's putting in its pitch to say that it is a leader of regionalism. Then of course, India under Nehru said, no, let's try non-alignment. Okay, something I believe will be picked up on in the Q&A at some point. And Indonesia, of course, said, we are now also the proud inheritor of a new nation state built upon the foundations of the Dutch East Indies. And the best of all, we fought the colonial power tooth and nail. All right, so we have every legitimate right to try to be a leader. So all these permutations and constellations played out, and it all ended up with experiments with the precursors to ASEAN. So I don't know how many of you remember the Association of Southeast Asia, ASA. Okay, and then there was Mafilindo, Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia. All right, and then there was CITO. CITO was too exotic. It included the Philippines alongside Pakistan. How could that be a sufficiently regional bloc? And then there was also Britain, the departing colonial power involved. So again, CITO was a non-starter, I think, in terms of a serious regional plan. All right, and then because ASA and Mafilindo were too mini-lateral, okay, and that's why I said certain things about mini-lateralism being healthy up to a point, in my Q&A for day one, okay, and then they decided that ASEAN was, basically the only going concern. So it started with ASEAN 5, and then after the Cold War ended, you realized that all of Indochina wanted to join ASEAN, which was a good thing. All right, I know that my time is coming to an end. So, all right, just 2 more points. So ASEAN should be seen as a historical culmination of experiments at regional leadership. And that is why I end on an optimistic note that ASEAN will endure because it has found, okay, and to quote, or rather to echo Fred earlier on, this middle position. Okay, you can dismissively call it fence sitting, but then you can say that, you know, it's a strategic middle position where it can lean towards some great powers, some of the time depending on the agenda. So that's modular mini-lateralism, if you can call it that. And it can lean towards others at certain other points in time. And the beauty about the AOIP is that it allows ASEAN this rehabilitation of the idea of this flexible centrality. Okay, so the AOIP is a wonderful eternal Christmas present, if I can use such a flowery term, because it says everything pleasant to all the great powers. You want to connect with Southeast Asia through an idea such as freedom of navigation of the seas. Okay, let's talk. And of course, that's also simultaneously a signal to China, let's be constructive on the South China Sea. At the same time, it talks about connectivity in cyber terms, economic terms, other kinds of physical transportation terms. That is also a nod to China to say, look, we are also going to buy into your vision of the BRI. We're also saying the same thing to Japan and India. You want us to connect with you so that we have a win-win economic collaboration under whatever label you prefer, RCEP or others. Let's do it. So in that sense, the AOIP represents a culmination of a reiteration, I think, that ASEAN will always be central for the foreseeable future, because we've tried all the other combinations with all other types of leaders, including the great powers, and they all did not work. So I think ASEAN will by default be there between the BRI and the FOIP. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chong. We'll quickly move on to Dr. Chiew-Ping and to bring her own view from outside of our RSIS to this discussion. Dr. Hu, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joel. And first of all, I would like to thank Center for Multilateralism Studies of RSIS and of course, Dr. Frederick Kliem, so kind to invite me to join this conversation. So I really like how Professor Chong ended on the point of the sense of autonomy that the Southeast Asian country holds. And that is where we base our argumentation on our ASEAN centrality. And I really like the word that you named polycentralism. So I will try to add on some of my own interpretation about what that means. So when we talk about ASEAN centrality, I mainly see two dimensions. One is internal looking and the other is outward looking. There are three communities, obviously, political security, social, cultural, and economy, and there are multi-layers and multi-tracks mechanism. So what do I mean by multi-layer is that we know that there are ASEAN +1, so it can be ASEAN US, ASEAN China, ASEAN Japan, ASEAN Korea. So, and on top of that, ASEAN +3, +6, the East Asian Summit, and eventually the RCEP, ABMM+, and the tracks involving the government, track 1.5, track 2, think tankers, academia. So we have a very healthy ecosystem to generate many new ideas about what do we mean by ASEAN centrality. So when Amitabh Acharya asked the question, is ASEAN centrality a myth? So we are exploring this idea that do we understand what we talk about ASEAN centrality when we talk about it? Much like during the Cold War, the US and Soviet Union talk about strategic stability. So does anyone actually mean what does it mean by that? So in terms of the inward dimension of ASEAN centrality, I think this discussion has been missing from many of the, either from academic literature or within the think tank discourse. So in terms of intra-ASEAN outlook, we don't really talk much about how integrated we are. So ASEAN integration has been taken for granted because of our multilateral fora. So we are used to being addressed as a single entity. So what has not been really, and sometimes been criticized, is actually our divide. So instead of ASEAN unity, we are ASEAN divided. So there is along the line of what I call Mekong or mainland maritime Southeast Asia element to it. And it's very obvious that the mainland Southeast Asian or the Mekong countries are obviously facing much more pressure from China than the rest of the Southeast Asian countries. And I think from the Mekong countries' perspective, the maritime Southeast Asian has not been doing much for them. So, and this is why we have the scenario in 2012 where we cannot stand behind an ASEAN statement about South China Sea Code of Conduct negotiation. So this actually highlights what we lack of. So for this year, the theme for ASEAN is about cohesive and a responsive ASEAN. So, and I think what we really lack is internal resilience, actions, and also binding mechanism. So the South China Sea dispute certainly highlight another dimension of divide within ASEAN. So when we move away from the strategic area and looking at ASEAN economic community, we are not that integrated either. So there is a vision of by 2025, we should reach a massive increase in intra-ASEAN trade. But I don't think we are going to hit the target because not many efforts have been invested in moving towards that direction. So what I see is, I think Professor Chong and also Frederick has mentioned about the element of connectivity. So we talk about connectivity with China, with Korea, and with US Indo-Pacific strategy, but how about intra-ASEAN connectivities? So we are supposed to receive all this investment, assistance, and whatnot to build the bridges of our gaps. But has that been realized? And more often than not, we realize that we are actually being hampered by our own domestic interests. So the domestic leadership among all 10 countries in Southeast Asia also give rise to this question of ASEAN centrality. Are we cohesion enough? Are we united enough? Can we unite against the tide, and currently the tide of Indo-Pacific? So we also need some kind of a coordination mechanism and also some standard harmonization when it comes to the technical problems in trade, increasing export among ourselves, in conducting investment, etc. And even on the South China Sea issues, we don't really have a very vibrant coordinating or on consultation mechanism among ourselves before we present a kind of a front with the external powers. So what I see is that we are each countries in ASEAN trying to preserve our own autonomy, and we come from a position of asymmetry. Obviously, we are much weaker compared to our major stakeholders and major dialogue partners. So what we can do about this? So we perceive what are our risks and also opportunities. So from here, I would like to respond to one of Frederick's point about taking sides. I think it is very dangerous for ASEAN to take side. So why do we hold on to this ASEAN centrality and this spectrum of position that we are taking on? Australian Prime Minister very recently in his speech also talks about an Indo-Pacific alliance. So, and that actually adds pressures on smaller countries like us in Southeast Asia specifically. So we would take position along the spectrum. So say this is US and this is China. Like it or not, we would take some contrasting positions in regards to two competing powers. Say after US ASEAN had their maritime exercise, immediately in less than a year, we also have maritime exercise with China. So this is how we kind of reach a balance between two great powers. And it's extremely dangerous when we take a side, because you have to think about what is at risk for the domestic leadership for the country as well. So it is not that easy for us to reject or to accept a certain power. We certainly has embraced Indo-Pacific in our own way. So ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, I also heard in the process, there are some countries like including Singapore that does not agree with some of the proposed statement coming from Indonesia. But in our own ASEAN way, we managed to reach a consensus and release a kind of a position that is agreeable by all 10 countries, even though it is not perfect. So I think I will end my remarks here so that we have more time for question and answers. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Hu, and thank you to Alan and Fred as well for your excellent expositions on the state of ASEAN. And interesting, I really appreciate Professor Chong's historical look, which actually puts us in a good position to look forward and see what has worked for ASEAN in the past and remind us that actually these problems are not as new as they seem and actually are quite familiar to those who have been following things very carefully. One thing I noticed that all three speakers shared was this idea that ASEAN centrality is sort of pivotal, as in ASEAN support for either any major sides to achieve their success. And this pivotal support is therefore ASEAN's greatest strength. And as Dr. Hu reminds us, it is contingent on the ability of ASEAN states to be united, to take a common position on things, and to agree. With that, I'm going to move to questions and answers. I'm going to abuse my position as chair to ask a few burning questions of my own first. Okay, so Dr. Alan Chong, whose final slide showed us a few of the earlier things, reminded me that in the past few days of this webinar series, we've actually had several questions on non-alignment. And in fact, I'm looking at the Q&A, and perhaps I'm already anticipating some of the similar concerns of people. Now, it strikes me that one of the key differences with non-alignment, very large major powers involved in the non-aligned movement. You had China, India, for example, Brazil, who were steadfastly non-aligned. So whereas you had the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc and then the non-aligned groups of countries, today it's a little bit different because you have almost all of the major actors are themselves strategic actors in this growing sort of tension. So what does that imply, or what are the implications for non-alignment, or the hopes for non-alignment, or not even a much simpler version of simply not choosing sides for ASEAN? Perhaps I'll start with Fred to get your response to this one. And the other two, if you feel like answering, please do chip in. Fred.
Hi, Joel. I must admit, unfortunately, that you were interrupted quite a few times here on my end, and I didn't really catch the full depth of what you said. But if I understand correctly, you asked about non-alignment and how is it possible for ASEAN to stay non-aligned. Is that correct? Is that
well,
roughly?
Yes. I mean, the difference is that every major power today is involved in this strategic mix, right? So they're not, unlike the past non-alignment, when you had several major powers stepping away from the US-Soviet rivalry, today you don't really have that luxury because, you know, China is an actor, India is an actor, previously non-aligned movement leaders, but now themselves strategic actors. So what does that imply for the much smaller states now in ASEAN who are now considering this sort of rivalry and competition going on around them?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think now I got you. Okay, thank you. So I guess India is actually quite an important point with the non-alignment because it's quite often seen as still as one of the non-aligned countries and really focusing on remaining strategically non-aligned. And I believe this has changed very much, and this is this non-alignment idea, as the foreign minister of India always says, is kind of passé in this new strategic environment. And I think this he actually misses no opportunity to repeat this point when whenever he speaks. So, and I believe this can actually be translated onto ASEAN. And I would like not to be misunderstood. I never said ASEAN should really choose sides now, once and for all, and enter an alliance with either or. What I was really referring to is what I guess what Ellen Chong, I think Ellen Chong called it just now strategic middle ground, strategic middle position, something like this. Yeah, great. I mean, I call it issue-based side choosing. This is exactly the thing I'm talking about. So this is not necessarily permanent strategic alignment, but what this is ASEAN needs to, smaller ASEAN state needs to realize that there is no such thing as alignment and non-alignment. You're either part of the blocks or you're not. What they need to realize is that their alignment is their multilateralism. Their alignment is their own multilateralism. This is their strength. What is needed for this is that ASEAN agrees on certain principles, okay? That they map out principles that they will adhere to, and they need to be very, very clear. So for instance, one principle I think ASEAN needs to agree on is that we unequivocally support UNCLOS and freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and that we really need to outright reject China there, and we need to side with America on this issue. But on the other hand, we also do not side with a trade war. So ASEAN needs to be very clear that we support free trade and that we are with China on this idea and that we really push for RCEP. So what I'm talking here about is issue-based side choosing, right? So this really goes away from non-alignment or alignment. This really goes to, you have to be strategically flexible and base this on certain principles and write this down in a treaty everybody can agree on. And that holds legal ground for all of ASEAN. And in fact, there are precedents in ASEAN for legally binding agreements when it comes to HADA, for instance, as you may recall. So I think this is really what ASEAN needs to do. They need to map out certain principles. They need to align themselves on a basis of issues, if you still want to use that word, alignment. But you could also call it strategic positioning in the middle, or you could call it issue-based side choosing, or whatever you want to call it.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to have a go at that question?
I have quite a bit to respond to. Okay, you've mentioned the buzzword non-alignment, and that's set off a chain of ideas here. Now, non-alignment, if you look at its practice during the Cold War, the period roughly 1945 to 91, you can be very derisory in commenting that it was just fluff, all right? You know, and fall back on a new realist argument to imply that at the end of the day, it was the superpowers that pulled the strings. But if you look carefully at non-alignment during the Cold War, it was actually a very slippery but comfortable middle ground. And I think just to often answer across the three questions that are outstanding at the moment in the question and answer room, I'll give you three perspectives as to why ASEAN is practicing its own brand, self-made brand of non-alignment. Okay, and I play off Fred's comments. First of all, the idea of the strategic tilt. Okay, T-I-L-T. It's a tilt. It looks like we're leaning towards one great power on an issue, but we're also leaning towards another great power on a connected issue. So in that sense, we are non-aligned. We can appear to be siding with them without actually siding with them. So Fred brought up this nice, case of the South China Sea. We are one with the United States and the European Union on freedom of navigation and respecting UNCLOS and so on. That we cannot be on the same frequency with China, because China says, I'm using historical arguments to claim the South China Sea. But what we can find community, soft community with China on the South China Sea is this idea of doing things quietly, away from the glare of nationalist publicity, by negotiating this code of conduct quietly away from the cameras. All right. And also we are pragmatic. Okay. Much as we have the South China Sea being disputed by 6 claimants and so on, it does not mean that we cannot conduct cooperative economic activities. So if you look at the political economy map of the South China Sea, there's a whole lot of cross-cutting deals going on. And I think in that regard, one must not dismiss ASEAN's subtle non-alignment out of hand. All right. And, you know, number two, you see ASEAN's synthetic non-alignment in terms of what I would call open access to markets. Okay, we have never closed our markets to the United States, notwithstanding the Trump presidency's bluster about, you know, making America first and so on. If you look at the headline-making visits in the first 1.5 years of the Trump presidency by Southeast Asian leaders, and of course, you know, Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe made the first most spectacular visit. All right, the moment, you know, Trump was preparing to enter the White House, he made, you know, a flying visit to I believe it was Mar-a-Lago. All right, you know, to say let's make all kinds of deals, all right, to help American businesses. And the same thing happened with ASEAN leaders individually. We all went to Washington and said, all right, we'll sign this to help American companies, you know, get an edge and so on and so forth. So in this sense, we are still a friend of the United States, notwithstanding Trump's bluster. With China, we've been talking trade, you know, for the longest time under the China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, which is, I believe, going into its version 2.0 soon. And then, of course, there was, you know, the aborted Trans-Pacific Partnership, in which China was also waiting to join. Now there's RCEP, in which Beijing is publicly committing to join. So there's open access to the markets for everybody. And you look at Indonesia's maneuvers recently, they are saying to China, can we kickstart some economic activity? We'll allow you to bring some Chinese workers in. Of course, you know, they have to bear the domestic blowback from COVID-19 induced Indonesian unemployment. But, you know, they're looking at China to be an economic locomotive. So that doesn't freeze out Beijing. And of course, if you look at the big infrastructure projects, Japan isn't frozen out either. In fact, the Indonesians are quietly also telling the Japanese, all right, you've lost one high-speed rail project. It doesn't mean that, you know, you cannot compete with the Chinese in our other projects. So it's an open market. And I think the Mekong too, you know, one should, okay, I take inspiration from Dr. Hu's comments. The Indo-Chinese countries are also very shrewd diplomatic operators. They all don't want to be held, you know, hostage to Beijing's whims. So much as they openly say, okay, we welcome money and funding under the Belt and Road, we also quietly are signing deals with the Japanese. Now, one must not forget that Japan has got a huge store of goodwill in Phnom Penh, for instance. This, you know, is very understated, very quiet. You have to actually talk to people to understand that they really have significant political caching in Indo-China, which they don't flaunt the way the Chinese do, but they do, all right? They don't produce mega projects, but they do fund all the soft things that the Indo-Chinese countries need to improve the population's middle class access and so on. And finally, the last angle of ASEAN-style non-alignment is to put in diplomatic gestures of equidistance. So, you know, the AOIP is a classic document, and I think Dr. Hu Chiew-Ping highlighted that. You know, it says everything pleasant to everybody. You know, no great power can get offended by it. Neither can any ASEAN country get offended by it. So, you know, you need to applaud ASEAN just for that. So AOIP is the embodiment of ASEAN-style non-alignment. Thank you.
So if I may address the non-alignment question, I think when I mention dangerous, I mean in the way that the United States has kind of turned this into an ideological confrontation, much like during the Cold War time. So why do I say this is because various US administrations, secretaries has made different statements, but they all sound the same. They quote China as Chinese Communist Party. So, and the use of the language of like-minded partners and countries, it held ASEAN hostage in the way that if we don't reject communist China, then we are on the other side. But this is not true because they obviously forgot that Vietnam is a communist party regime as well. So what does that say about Malaysia, for instance? So I see two questions addressing why my foreign minister says something about that is very pro-China. So within the domestic leadership itself, there are different interests. So immediately after Foreign Minister Hishammuddin made that statement, which is not true, Malaysia actually submitted a note verbal to United Nations that we reject China's claims in Xisha and Nansha, the new administrative area that China declared. We call them illegal. So that is one of the strongest language that we ever used in recent years. And not less under this Perikatan Nasional government, so which is quite telltale of where we perceive risk and also opportunity. So non-aligned is not a choice. It's the way that we don't want to promote an order that is of intense competition and rivalry. So some major powers have used ASEAN multilateral fora as a platform for competition. So even in RCEP negotiation, we can see there is a haggling between China and India. It almost being held hostage by their negotiation, and eventually India drop out and everyone is not very happy. So we don't want that to happen. We want the other powers and ASEAN major stakeholders to think that our ASEAN-based platforms are platform for complementary cooperation rather than competition. So I hope I addressed all that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hu, and the rest. Okay, I'll turn now to some of the questions that have been asked from the online attendees. The first one that I have here, Kogila Balakrish. The ASEAN mediation strategy is fantastic, but the challenge is how will this be successful when ASEAN countries themselves have divergent interests with Quad countries and China? How can ASEAN countries manage intra-ASEAN leadership? So yes, the idea that ASEAN itself has a variety of interests to contend with among its members, and as has been noted in our webinars the previous 2 days, global leadership has been somewhat absent. So how can ASEAN come up with its own leadership at this time? Anybody would like to go on this question of help developing ASEAN leadership?
So maybe I can go first.
Sure, please.
So I think this goes back to what we talk about, the intra-ASEAN cohesiveness. So we need to respond in a cohesive manner, and how are we going to do that? In the 90s, I think it's the golden era for ASEAN leadership. So we have strongman leadership from ASEAN founding countries, and so sorry about that. Despite the diverging interests among ourselves, we can actually reach a kind of a consensus through leaders, communication among leaders. So what we are currently lacking right now is that a sense of a strong leadership from within ASEAN. So this is why it is even more urgent for ASEAN to focus on ASEAN integration rather than expanding ASEAN in the way. And that will help us to manage not only intra-ASEAN trade problems, but also on South China Sea issue, Indo-Pacific framework, and so on and so forth.
Okay. Thank you very Fred, please go ahead.
Yeah, if I may quickly add something to that question as well. I mean, if COVID-19 has shown us anything, then it is that one ASEAN country's concern is very much every ASEAN country's concern, okay? And excuse me, all ASEAN leaders must realize that their individual future is inevitably interconnected. I mean, for God's sake, if you completely refuse everything on the South China Sea because it may offend China, what if Vietnam gives up on ASEAN? Then how? Right, so we really need to realize that ASEAN members need to hang together on particular principles. I spoke about these principles before, and I think when we speak about certain ASEAN countries being closer to China and certain ASEAN countries being a bit further away from China and so forth, that's all true. But no country is dancing to China's tune. I would like to really, really reiterate this. No country is dancing to China's tune. No country is simply doing any bidding of China, okay? China is not some sort of proxy, as sort of penetrated ASEAN via a proxy. And you can see this, that there is greater alignment among ASEAN regarding the South China Sea. I've mentioned that before in the latest statement, for instance, but also in previous statements before. And we know that countries would have the possibility to water this down substantially. And maybe they did even water it down a bit, but it's still relatively strong. Also consider the very name of the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. The Chinese foreign minister, when he called this the Indo-Pacific idea, will just dissipate like foam in the ocean, right? And it's not a secret at all that China is very displeased with this concept of the Indo-Pacific, and yet ASEAN decided to name it ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific and kind of adopt this term. And even say the Philippines and the President Duterte are also relatively, let's say, they are strategically flexible, yeah, moving moving strategically to and fro. And I also would say that there is great consensus among ASEAN that has been generated around COVID-19, how to deal with this, and there's unity. So even if I would say that containment, yeah, it cannot be sold to ASEAN, of course it cannot, but this is not about containment at all, it's about precisely preventing containment, and ASEAN needs to stick together in order to prevent this containment idea of China, right? So facilitate communication so that hard balancing can be practiced, but need not escalate. I think this is very important here. And again, there we are at the strategic middle position. And I think it is possible to generate consensus among ASEAN. As far as leadership is concerned, I would say the issue of leadership within ASEAN has always been discussed very long, right? I mean, there was always Indonesia around, but then lately there is this idea of sectoral leadership, right? That in particular areas such as security policy, we have countries such as Vietnam who could take on leadership and probably also do. And I think this is really the way forward. It's not so much anymore that the largest country needs necessarily to exercise leadership. And if the largest country doesn't engage in a certain project, this project cannot be moved forward. You can look towards the European Union, for instance, where it was long the case that either France or Germany had to move everything in the European Union. And this is not the case anymore at all, right? Small countries can unilaterally get together, like as you saw recently in the budget, in the Frugal Four, get together smaller countries in order to get greater heft, and they can really move things within the European Union. And I think in ASEAN this can be the same thing. Certain countries take on leadership on specific sectors and move things there. Thank you.
Okay, if I can quickly add, one must not forget this time-honored diplomatic procedure called the ASEAN Way. So this is in response to Balakrishnan's question. It still operates because you cannot have the chair of the year, okay, i.e. Vietnam saying, I want this to be done, and that's the end of discussion. No, that's not the way ASEAN, intra-ASEAN leadership operates, okay? And Fred is of course describing using more modern language, this process. You see, something has to be surfaced first, and then the other ASEAN countries need to weigh in. And you realize that when the summits and conferences take place on Zoom, ironically, Zoom is made for this kind of thing. Not everyone can go first, you know, in terms of speech. You have to wait your turn to speak. So, you know, the ASEAN way still operates. There is an appearance at the end of the day of consensus, even if there have been degrees of difference with the initial proposal floated by a particular member state. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alan. All right, the next question, Go Hanwha asks, it's addressed to Dr. Hu. You mentioned taking sides is dangerous to us, dangerous in the sense that ASEAN nations might lose sovereignty on issues such as the South China Sea dispute. So is it that if ASEAN tries to get these compromise lowest common denominator or middle positions, what does it say about its ability to stand on such certain things?
Right, thank you. So I think that middle position doesn't have to be necessarily a bad position, because COC negotiation, no matter what, must go on, even though we know that the end product may not be as strong as we want it to be, but at least that would be a guiding framework, at least legally speaking. One of the criticism of ASEAN is that we are not a legally binding organization in terms of TAC and many of our form of cooperation, including ADMN+. But yet these are the area that we actually get most of the working relationship going on. So I think what Professor Tommy Koh has proposed in his one of his latest book is about building a legal order in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN. I think that is one of the priority that ASEAN should pay attention to. So with that, I also answer Goh Han Hwa's another question that ASEAN need to take the side of the rule of the law.
Thank you. 2 for 1. Very good. Thank you. Okay, so the next question is from Mr. Charlie Brown. The ASEAN-US Special Summit was cancelled. What should be the priority outcome for a rescheduled ASEAN-US Summit? I don't think it's going to happen before the US election. Let's put it to the panelists this way. So the US elections and COVID-19 already put to rest the past proposal for the ASEAN members to all go to Washington. So what is the new priorities for the US and ASEAN relationship outside of perhaps the external dimension that we've all been talking about? And especially what would you think about it going forward with the elections, depending on who might win? Or, who would like to go first? Maybe Fred?
Yeah, okay, Ken. Okay, I would also agree that I think it's very, very, very unlikely. I would put all my money on it that the summit will not take place before the election. I mean, I think that's pretty clear. Even if the East Asia Summit would take place physically, I also don't think there will be any American participation so close before the elections and so forth. So I think it's relatively unlikely that ASEAN will get a chance, or ASEAN leaders will get a chance to engage with whoever becomes president after the election. So I guess there are two things to the question. One is the priorities, and one is, depending on who wins the election, what is going to be different, right? I don't think there's going to be anything different. Consider Biden, a Biden presidency, right? Consider a Trump presidency, things will remain relatively similar to what they are now. Consider a Biden presidency. I also think things for this region will stay relatively similar, I must say, because Joe Biden will be confronted with so many manifold issues, right? Domestically, there is a great need to reconcile different sides of the debate after the great divisor Donald Trump has left office, right? There will be a deep economic recession the president will have to deal with, and so forth. So I think Asia will be relatively low, especially ASEAN will be relatively low on the priority list. However, if there is one thing in the United States, I think pretty much everyone can agree on, and there's bipartisan consensus on, as far as I understand, is that China is behaving well out of order, okay, in this region. So I think, and this brings us to the priorities. So I think what needs to be done is, if the United States come to ASEAN, they do not need to have a priority list, right? They do not need to do anything. What ASEAN needs to do is, however, is earn its centrality, right? ASEAN needs to convince the United States that it is beyond words of the United States, an absolutely integral part of their Indo-Pacific strategy. And if they move ahead with the Quad and completely neglect the multilateral pillar of what I call the China management strategy, right? The Americans completely neglect this. We will inevitably end up in a Cold War situation and likely in a war situation, right? In a hot war situation. So in the long run. So ASEAN really needs to get their act together, decide on the priority list they want to push forward with the Americans, and then go to the United States and convince them that they are the best and in the best position to be an honest broker between the two blocks, if you like, right? And that multilateralism is an absolute inevitable part of a, say, new multipolar stable balance globally, but specifically, of course, here in the region. ASEAN needs to be part of this, in fact, needs to be at the center of this, and they need to convince the Americans that multilateralism is important, not the other way around.
I have responded to that by typing out an answer.
Thank you.
I'll pause my time.
Okay. Yeah, right. Thank you. Okay, so let's move. This is by Henrik Chong for Frederick. Even if the ASEAN summit appears to show that ASEAN is frustrated and pushing back against Chinese assertiveness, this was done under Vietnam as ASEAN chair. When Brunei and Cambodia take on the ASEAN chair in the coming years, do you think this pushback will be diminished given the tendency of these countries to avoid being confrontational to China?
My response to Henrik is the ASEAN way will rule it all. All right. It is a living mantra, you know, that people actually act on. So even if they are inclined to tilt towards China, they have to mind the fact that the other 9 may not agree. So they run the risk, if they want to drive ASEAN towards China, you know, they have to make sure that it doesn't tear a diplomatic rift in the face of this thing called ASEAN consensus. So I think there are constraints to Brunei and Cambodia driving ASEAN closer into the arms of China. That's my view.
Perhaps if I was specifically addressed, can I also? I would also like to add something to this.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, of course, it's impossible to predict the future, right? Who knows what's going to happen? But I think maybe the pushback will be diminished. I think, as he put it, it's possible, but I don't think it's very likely, because for one thing, once the genie is out of the bottle, it's very difficult to get it back in, right? So we have now certain language that is being adopted on the South China Sea, and I don't think you can really move backwards on this, because if you do, then you will be seen as, then it will be very obvious that it really is a matter of Vietnam was the chair and they did it, and Cambodia and Brunei are not able to get the support, or dancing to the tune of China, which they do not want to be seen as, right? So especially in Cambodia, right? We all know this issue about 2012, right? Where they couldn't agree on the communique and so forth. I mean, this is been recited so often, I don't need to repeat this here. Everybody will know. And yet Cambodia is not very happy with this, right? I mean, they're not very happy with how this is now spun for the past 8 years, being spun as Cambodia is really just bidding to China's tune. They're not happy with this at all, because they see this as a great diplomatic loss on their side, right? So I don't think they're going to repeat there's going to be a repetition of this. So I think even though I would possibly agree that there will not be a further pushback or move forwards, even, we will definitely not move back. I would be very surprised if we would move back in terms of language, specifically because it is not everything is up to the chair. Okay, the chair, as we know, is an important part of ASEAN, of the agenda setting for that year and so forth, and it will probably be true that the South China Sea is not utmost on the Cambodian chairmanship's mind. It's probably true because they don't have a direct stake possibly in there, but also I don't think they can completely disregard it, and I don't think they will. And I'm pretty certain that we will at least not move back.
Okay, thank you, Fred.
That's a very quick note add to what Frederick has shared. So even Brunei, who rarely speaks up on the South China Sea issue, has released a statement a week before Malaysia has done so on the South China Sea issue. So I think, and of course, through our communication with our Cambodian friends and colleagues, obviously they are very much aware about their 2012 diplomatic outcome. So I believe that even though there may be some form of receding voice in comparison to Vietnam this year especially, but we will not give up on our position, especially on the issues that matter to all ASEAN member states.
Thank you very much. Okay, so if I may abuse my position as a moderator again to ask a final question. We promised to be future-looking, and the post-pandemic or post-COVID-19 era may be upon us at some point. So I would like to pose a question. We know that ASEAN is currently in virtual summit mode, rather like what we're doing today. But the European Union has actually convened already a physical summit where they talked about post-pandemic recovery. A question to any of you, what do you think ASEAN's next steps should be to try to either to resume summits, or whether you think that's a terrible idea, and also reopening between countries? Now, we already have so much controversy over reopening our own countries, right? What to reopen when. it strikes me that it's an even greater challenge to try to reopen between countries where you don't have any control over what's going on in your neighbor, yet you have to trust them and they have to trust you in equal measure as the thing goes. So what is going to be the challenge for ASEAN as it tries to get life back to normal going forward?
Okay, if I may quickly shoot off.
Yes, Alan, please.
I would think that a physical meeting is necessary with social distancing practice. Maybe they need to sit 2 chairs or 3 chairs away from one another as we see, around us. But physically meet they must, because face to face you can provide reassurances that between governments that they're doing their best. And the idea of a travel bubble, which is, I think, under serious consideration by all ASEAN leaders, has to be re-established to kickstart ASEAN as a regional economy. Because if people cannot travel, then I think the economy, the respective national economies will continue to be paralyzed for an indefinite period of time, which is unacceptable. And I take note of President Duterte's comment in reimposing a serious lockdown in Manila, that he cannot afford more than 2 weeks, which is a serious signal that the economy cannot wait for the pandemic to be over. All right, thank you.
Yeah, anybody else would like? Okay, Fred again.
Okay, perhaps I go next then. So first, I think physical meetings, yes, are absolutely inevitable. It's absolutely necessary. And I think we, over the past 2 days, we heard this from several speakers that they said, look, certain things such as the negotiations on the code of conduct and even RCEP negotiations and so forth cannot really be held virtually to the fullest extent. I mean, it's just absolutely necessary that there are side meetings, that there are one-on-one, 3-on-1 and so forth talks. And I think this is why the European Union actually, as you mentioned it, decided to get together again, even though the situation there is everything but under control, right? It's slightly subsiding, really subsiding, but it's not under control at all. And they still decided to meet because they knew it would be impossible to agree on a large a multi-annual framework and a large EU budget, but also on a bailout without having physical contact, right? And you saw all those photos coming out of Merkel and Macron sitting together with Charles Michel on this balcony and taking one leader after the other on this balcony to discuss, right? It's absolutely inevitable to have this. How can this happen? Well, it can happen without journalists. It can happen without perhaps only one staffer per prime minister or so forth, right? So it needs to be very, very limited. And there needs to be like some sort of a travel bubble, I guess, from the leaders, right? It needs to be either private planes or contained. There needs to be some testing involved, I guess, and isolated transport. And I think this way it is possible and is absolutely necessary. This at least refers to ASEAN-only meetings. Whether you can have a wider East Asia summit and so forth, I'm not so sure about that. Whether other countries would be willing to travel at this time, other leaders would be willing to travel, probably not. But next year this needs to resume. But ASEAN meetings, perhaps even this year, still possible and necessary, absolutely. Travel bubble. So I've absolutely, literally no clue about viruses, right? I'm not a medical doctor, and I have no idea about how viruses spread. So I really will not comment on this. I think it's a bit misplaced that everybody thinks they need to comment on how viruses spread, right? But what I can comment on is regionalism. And I believe that regionalism needs trust, okay? Regionalism cannot function if countries unilaterally shut their border and disrupt travel for too long. This is necessary for both regionalism, trust in regionalism and regional friendship, but it is also absolutely necessary, as Prof. Allen said, absolutely necessary to revive the economies here. And this is necessary. And at some point you have to really, of course, you always have to weigh up health considerations and economic considerations, but at some point you really have to try to establish those travel bubbles. And I think regional organizations are best placed to start this process. Right? This is where you have the most trust. This is where you have the most open communication channels and so forth. And I think really ASEAN should look towards a reciprocal Green Line Agreement. I think it's called, between Singapore and Malaysia. And we should really try to sort of implement something like this for the whole of ASEAN, just like the European Union is doing. Necessary for trust and necessary for the economy.
Great, thank you. Dr. Hu, would you like to have the final word for us, please?
Right, sure. So I think we are among the first in the world to hold the virtual meetings on COVID-19. So it is under the framework of ASEAN +3. So I think for the working levels officials to sort out the details before the leaders actually meet in person is especially important as well. So there has to be a two-layer ways of doing it right now. So virtually first and then in physical. About the travel bubble, I think some of the countries, especially countries like Taiwan, Japan, they are now experimenting on having a 7-day quarantine or a super fast swab test at the airport and things like that. So that there is no scientific data on the percentage of infected by the virus during the flight. So I think that is where the risk come from. So to move this forward, South Korea, so full disclosure, I'm a Korea Foundation Fellow. They are now working on a green economic recovery. So meaning that they are going to use digitalized economic ways of doing things, so to reduce contact physically while still keeping the economy moving. So I think there is potential for ASEAN Korea to experiment one way or another. And South Korean government is going to introduce the implementation blueprint of their new Southern policy. So, and in terms of ASEAN +3 framework, I think China and South Korea is getting ahead in responding with the ASEAN counterparts, but less so on the Japan because of their domestic political reason, as we can see from the cancellation of Olympics to Abe's domestic management. So Japan faced more problem than the other two Northeast Asian states. But eventually, I think we will have to find a new format of doing things, including combining the virtual and the physical ways of meetings.
Thank you so much. Thank you again, once again, to all our panelists. Thank you for bringing the future of ASEAN Centrality to life for us today, this afternoon. A reminder to all our attendees that we will have these videos up on YouTube very soon. And thank you so much for joining us. Good evening.
Thank you.